Mild temperatures across much of the country this afternoon. In Texas, 80s and even a few 90s showing up to the south. Let's take a look at that surface map. Cold air filtering into parts of the country, 40s across much of the Midwest and 20s in the northern plains. You can see that northerly component back there, but not very much precip, just some snow up there in Minnesota and in the Dakotas. The warm air is down to the south. There it is, 80s from Louisiana into South Texas. Temperatures are up to 91 degrees there at Laredo. We do have some elevated thunderstorms back behind the front. You can see the surface temperatures are around 50 degrees with dew points around 40. So this is taking place in an elevated layer. And there's more of it as you go into Arkansas and out there into Mississippi. Let's take a look at that high-resolution rapid refresh. There are some of those model-generated storms. We want to drop the sounding just slightly ahead of it and not in any precip. So there's your profile. Lots of juicy, moist air up there above 5,000 feet. That's going to be from 850 to 700 millibars. And that's the buoyant layer that's rising and producing this activity. It's not coming from the surface. And yeah, that's the frontal inversion right there. Let me back the pen away from there so you can get a better look. Temperatures around 50 degrees and then increasing to the mid-50s aloft, but considerable moisture. Dew points as high as low 50s, up at 6,000 feet. In the northeastern U.S., northerly flow, cooler temperatures, but not much precip. In fact, Philadelphia and Atlantic City, located right there and there respectively, have not had a 1-inch snow since January of last year. And that makes it the sixth snowiest, or the sixth non-snowiest period to date. In the southeast, very warm, but they've had a cool down this afternoon. Temperatures were near 90 degrees yesterday, and they are rising once again to the 80s, so just a little bit of relief in that region. As we mentioned in Texas, some storms. That's a look at the radar. Dallas-Fort Worth is located right in here, and Wichita Falls just to the north of this one storm here. You can see briefly there was a severe thunderstorm warning on that cell, and the main threat from these is going to be high winds. A few more cells lining up down to the south near Abilene. There's the shower activity in Arkansas. Certainly not very impressive. And some more showers and thunderstorms in Alabama. Now, to really get these to strengthen, what we need is some pressure falls to help draw that moisture and inflow to the north. And some instability would help as well. This afternoon, though, the instability profiles in Alabama look, I don't know, conditionally unstable and then kind of a stable layer aloft. Heading up to the northern plains, there's that cold air. Seems like a different world up there. I'm running the air conditioner here in Texas. Up to the north, they've had snowfall after snowfall. And Bismarck, it's going to be that station right there, they've had 85.6 inches for the season, making it the 5th snowiest winter. In the southwestern U.S., rain has been the story in California. They are getting a break this afternoon, but going into Thursday and Friday, more rain moving in with significant warm air advection. The Sierra Nevadas have been extremely snowy. They've had 16 feet of snow in the past week at the UC Berkeley Snow Lab, located about right in there. And for the season, they've had 46 feet of snow. Now, with that warm air advection, that's going to make things a little bit interesting. We'll get into that a little bit later, but let's head up north into the northwestern U.S. Some snows there in the Wasatch Range. They've had 53 feet of snow this season at Alta, so they too are getting quite a bit of precip. Going up north, there's a little occluded system working off of Washington, and going into Alaska, mild in the interior, teens, 20s, and 30s, but up to the north, a new front moving in. and that's replaced this warm air mass, which yesterday produced a record temperature up there at Barrow, which is now the Inuit name of Utqiagvik. I had to look that one up, but that's the name they go by up there. The previous record was 23 degrees, and they had 31 degrees yesterday, and those are temperatures we usually see in May. Dead Horse near Prudhoe Bay, 28 degrees yesterday, and that also was a record. Heading out to Canada, a little sliver of Arctic air, supported by this big 1050 millibar ridge. Now, normally when we get 1050 millibars up there during the wintertime, that comes straight south, but we don't really have that set up for this particular pattern. In fact, the thickness lines are pretty much parallel to the isobars, and that's an indication that there's just not much advection. Any advection that we do have is mostly associated with that anticyclone building to the southeast. Some major changes in the stratosphere. This is what the stratosphere looked like about 3 weeks ago. This is the 10 millibar chart up near 100,000 feet, so that's even higher than the SR-71 flew. So what we see here is a anticyclone building across the western Arctic, and we've also got the polar vortex located over Europe. So that's going to be it right there. With that, we've got the cyclonic flow around it, and anticyclonic flow across Alaska and far eastern Siberia. However, here's what we have for today. The weather is dominated by this anticyclone, and that covers almost the entire polar region. So this is a reversal of the usual cyclonic polar vortex flow up at that level. And that does have significant impacts in the lower stratosphere and down into the troposphere. A lot of that is still being studied, but we're starting to get that coupling this week with a decrease in the Arctic Oscillation Index. That means that more polar air is flowing south in the lower troposphere. Now, one problem that we have is that we don't have the positive P&A pattern to kick that polar air into the U.S. We've got the opposite. We've got a negative P&A pattern. Now, if it's positive, what we have is high heights aloft, or high pressure across Alberta and British Columbia. We would have low heights or low pressure around Florida, and low heights or low pressure around the Aleutians, and we're talking about in the upper levels of the atmosphere. But we've got the opposite. We've got this big old low across western Canada. We've got this ridging pretty close to the Aleutians, and ridging as well in Florida. So that definitely puts us in a negative P&A pattern. We're also in a negative NAO pattern, and that's due to the flow being a little bit weak out there in the Atlantic. It does look like it's picking up a little bit. And as far as the AO pattern, the Arctic Oscillation, we don't really see this on the upper air chart. We have to look at the surface patterns, and we look for a lot of high pressure in the polar regions and lower pressure in the temperate latitudes. And moving forward, we see this vortex up here start to break down, and the flow across the U.S. becomes more zonal. So now we're up to the weekend. The Pacific is fairly open. Some flow coming from the northwest up there, but the majority of it is coming from Hawaii into California. So that's helping us support the advection of moisture into the southwest U.S. Then going into next week, a little bit more amplified as we get into Tuesday and Wednesday, a large ridge moving into the plains and strong troughing on the west coast. So more rain for California once again. And some of that troughing will work into the plains later next week. So we're going to see a chance for thunderstorms once again around the middle of March. And of course, this looks a little bit ominous. 150 knot jet offshore heading for Oregon or Washington. So we could see some stormy weather going into around the 19th, 18th, 19th, 20th. And we are staring down the barrel of an AR. Of course, we're talking about an atmospheric river. And there it is, starting to make its approach into California. We run the charts forward, going into Thursday morning. That moisture approaches the coast, and then it starts moving inland later during the day. And we're seeing those darker red values around 700 to 1,000, which indicates a significant atmospheric river event, and it's going to affect much of the central and northern part of California. Some of the heavier impacts will be around the Bay Area, down towards Monterey and across towards Sacramento. And you can see these higher values, 1,000 to 1,200, approaching San Luis Obispo, Vandenberg in that area, so they're going to get it a little bit later. So this is on Friday. A lot of that moisture is spreading in, and then it starts crossing the Sierra Nevadas, going into the Great Basin area and into the Intermountain region over the weekend. And it remains quite stormy off of the west coast. A couple waves moving up towards Oregon and Washington, and then another slug of moisture heading for California for the 14th. So here we go again. So we take a look at the NAM forecast here. We start out with ridging across California for this evening. And there comes our weather system from the Pacific, the Pineapple Express moving inland. Some of the snow's starting up tomorrow morning in Northern California and spreading across the Sierra Nevadas during the afternoon. Now, there will be some warm air advection with this. In fact, you can see the deep southerly flow, the southwesterly gradient. All of this indicates warm air flowing into much of California, and that's going to impact the Sierra Nevadas, bringing the snow level up to about 8,000 feet. And you can see a transition over here as we go into Friday, starting to break out a lot of rain in the model, even in the higher terrain right there, and temperatures coming up into the upper 40s in the valleys. And that's all a consequence of that strong warming air flowing straight up from the south-southwest, and that's going to translate to a lot of snowmelt. As I mentioned, they've had record snowfalls there in the Sierra Nevadas, and when we dump all that rain on top of it, 1 to 3 inches of rain, that is going to melt quite a bit of it and send it down through the streams and creeks and rivers, and that can result in flooding throughout the foothills and into some of the lower elevations. The precipitation will start winding down as we get into late Friday. Now we're starting to see it moving into the Great Basin area as the upper level lift moves into that region. And not much left for Saturday. Now this is a chart we don't see too often. This is the Q vectors, and this is one way we can assess the vertical motion in the mid-levels of the atmosphere and show where the strongest forcing is. There's quite a bit of it off of Oregon and Washington. That's Q vector convergence. That indicates strong lift taking place in that region, and some lift as well up there around Salt Lake City and Wyoming. So we move forward. You can see some of that lift spreading into the Oregon coast, and it appears to be coupling with that strong southwesterly flow approaching California. And then we go into the big day, the precip day. That's going to be Thursday night into Friday. And it looks like there may be some artifacts in here due to the terrain interactions, but some significant lift right there moving across Nevada on Friday and then spreading eastward. And you can see these features are somewhat stationary. You can see the ripples in the height field. That does make this diagnostic tool a little bit complicated, but this shows you kind of the general situation. There goes that outgoing wave up to the north, sneaking off to the east on Sunday. Things quieting down across much of the western U.S., and then we brace for the next system. A couple waves approaching the west coast there, and things get pretty problematic going into the 14th and 15th. And let me back that up and look at the East Coast too. So we start out with this area of ascent, move into the overnight hours and into tomorrow. And this is a lot of lift spreading into Kansas, Nebraska, South Dakota, and that will produce some wintry weather in that part of the country. Let me move that away. Then you can see it moving across Iowa, going into tomorrow evening, and then into the Great Lakes for Thursday night. For Friday, a lot of that lift spreads into Pennsylvania and New York, and then to the East Coast region for Saturday. So you can see that this is a pretty cool diagnostic tool. And if you want to see some of these charts yourself, this is where to go. That's Embry-Riddle University. That's a page run by Sean Milrad. A more generalized forecast for the rest of the country, looking at pressure and 1,000 through 700 millibar thickness, showing the cold air and high pressure up there in Canada, and the northerly component, so that's supporting some of that snow in the northern Rockies and Minnesota. And closer to the southern front right there, you can see the elevated convection. So we go forward, and we're kind of waiting for this wave to come out of the Rockies that's going to interact with some of that cold air and help set up some warm air advection. Let me get that out of the way once again, and you can see the precip starting up early tomorrow from Iowa up through Omaha and up to Pierre. That spreads eastward very quickly into Chicago by tomorrow evening, and a pretty good band of snow extending into Minneapolis. The rain-snow line, according to the NAM, appears to be just south of Chicago, and things spread eastward overnight tomorrow night, and by early Friday, a mix of precip moving into Pittsburgh and some snow up there around Buffalo and Erie. And things continue spreading east, and not a whole lot of precip. It looks like we start entraining some drier air from the north, so a lot of the snow cuts off north of the New York Thruway. And for the southern U.S., it's March, and when it's March, we start looking for severe weather. Not a whole lot of that for today. In fact, what we're looking at here is a plot of the Cape. In other words, the instability through a deep layer. So a lot of this purple and blue shading, that corresponds to the instability in the atmosphere. And to get a lot of severe weather, we want to see it up into the greens, yellows, and reds. So, yeah, we do have a little bit of instability out there in the Big Bend area down into the Serrano del Burros, but doesn't look like that's going to do very much. Some dry air filtering south through Dallas. And, yeah, this is a pretty messy chart, but this has all of the essential features here for trying to understand where severe weather will develop. So one look at this, and I can kind of see what the pattern is doing. If we look at the wind plots, which are going to be these little flags right there, we can paint out the front. Shows up very readily. And on the other side right there, yeah, a little bit of convergence between the southerly flow in the Gulf of Mexico and the northerly flow up to the north. And that kind of outlines where the front is. So, yeah, certainly some elevated convection north of that front. And the best possibility for deep convection is down here. Now, we'll have to evaluate that independently. I really didn't see much in the way of severe weather being forecast down around San Antonio, but there is the convergence, and there is the modest instability. So we are missing something. I can see on the dew points here, the dew points are going to be these light green contours. Well, that's going to be dew points in the 50s and 60s, which is not great, but it's definitely elevated. So what's missing, I'm not really sure. But let's run the forecast through, going through Thursday. Some more warm air advection heading up north. Looks like more pressure falls in the Texas Panhandle. So with that warm, moist advection, we're starting to destabilize once again. And then as we go into Thursday night, another front coming south, but just not very much instability. And this is the most unstable Cape. So that kind of tells you we're not really looking for any severe weather. So this next surge of cold air spreads south, some more warm air advection on Saturday. And this looks a little bit more potent. Now, I'm not sure if that's a front or a dry line, but that does mark the westward extent of the moisture. So we're looking at Saturday here. Possibly a chance of storms. This is going to be peak heating. So that area and wherever the warm front is, maybe through here. So this whole area does have a little bit of potential that will need to be watched. So we take a quick look at the NAM here. Put that on Tulsa. And we've got a layer of cold air right there. So that's a negative factor. Also, poor lapse rates up to 12,000 feet. And above that, we do get some steepening of the lapse rates, so that points to elevated convection. Let's go a little bit further south, maybe towards Durant. So I'm kind of showing you how I work through this process. This looks a little bit more like a loaded gun, but still a lot of capping. The Cape, pretty modest, looking at generally under 1,000. And then around Interstate 40, maybe towards Muskogee. Yeah, still a whole lot of capping there, so we're going to have to wait and see about this particular day. And a quick check of the moisture quality. You can see the oranges there. Those are going to be 60s dew points. The purple is 70s dew points. So we're pretty much stuck with a lot of 60s along the Gulf Coast. Some of it flows as far north as Arkansas and Oklahoma, gets pushed down into the Gulf once again. You can see some strong cold air advection around the 14th. Then we get some moisture return around the 16th. 60s dew points coming up into Texas once again, but no 70s. So it looks like no major risk of severe weather in the foreseeable future, but we'll continue checking back in on that over the week ahead. And a quick check of the temperature records, looking for 80s tomorrow around Louisiana, and a record cold temperature in Burns, Oregon. Temperatures on Friday near normals. Same thing on Saturday. Some warm temperatures in South Texas on Sunday. Nothing for Monday, and nothing for Tuesday. So for much of the country, our biggest concerns will be precipitation and wind. And that will be all for our Wednesday edition of Forecast Lab. I want to thank our newest Patreon supporters, Arthur Carson, Oat Maelstrom, and Dennis Woods. Thank you very much for your support. And thanks to our other supporters who have joined recently, Matt Russo, William McGlynn, JWGO, Ian Schaefer, Zachariah. Thanks to all of you for helping to keep this program going. We'll see you back here on Friday for another edition of Forecast Lab. Have a great Wednesday evening. Bye-bye.